Hi, friends. Welcome back. It's good to be with you again. We're going to jump right into the training today. It's again going to feel like you're drinking from a water hose, and I'm going to give lots of information to you. But the beauty of this video is that you can go back and rewind, rewatch parts, pause it to look at the pictures of the quotes or images that I'm going to put into this video. But we're going to dive into the topic of trauma today and think particularly about how trauma impacts the adolescents that we love and support and guide. And this is hard information to hear. I imagine that many of you have heard about trauma. It's definitely a topic that is growing in the content out there that's available to us about the impacts of trauma, how trauma shows up, and the different systems that it's perpetuated through. And I'm going to ask you guys to engage with your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength again to this information. I'm going to predict that it's going to be hard to hear, and it might be even harder when you think about this information in the context of the young moms and teenagers and kids that you serve and love. And that's okay. We're going to do it with our strength. We're going to be brave because this is what we need to grapple with. From my perspective, what we need to grapple with and look at closely if we want to really to heal and usher in the kingdom of God like we talked about in the last video. So grab your notebook, grab your pen. I'm providing an outline for you, and we'll get started. Great. Let's get started with a working definition for trauma for the context of this conversation. This one comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and it's really looked at as the sum of an event plus an experience plus the impact. And let me break that down for you. So the event of trauma is an event or circumstance that could include the actual or the extreme threat of physical or psychological harm or the severe withholding of resources needed for healthy development. Let me say that again. The event part of trauma is an event or a circumstance that could include actual harm, physical or psychological harm, or the extreme threat of physical or psychological harm, or the severe withholding of resources needed for healthy development. And we know that when events happen, different people experience them differently, right? And so that's why we talk about the sum of the experience or the event plus the experience plus the impact, because there are different things that impact how someone might experience an event that could be harmful or cause trauma, right? One of the biggest things, and what we'll use for the context of the conversation today, is the developmental stage of the person who is experiencing the harm. So for a child to experience a traumatic event or a harmful event or the threat of one looks much different than an adult, because we know that children's brains are not developed enough to have an understanding of what's going on in the same way that adults do. So a young person who experiences a traumatic event can have a deeper impact. And so let's think about the impact, because that's also part of the trauma equation. The impact is basically that sometimes we can see the results or the adverse effects of this traumatic event right away. Oftentimes it shows up much later, and effects can include physical, mental, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, social, and spiritual challenges. Trauma has deep impact in the young people that we serve. And that's one of the important things that I want you to walk away knowing today. And this is the other important part, that oftentimes, in my experience, young adults and adolescents and teen moms that I've worked with don't have any sense of the connection between the impact of this traumatic event and the traumatic event that happened. They don't have the ability to say, man, I know that I show up and I experience this response in my body, or it impacts my life like this because I was neglected as a child, or because I witnessed domestic violence in the household, right? And so the qualities of trauma in our world are that it causes harm, right? There is harm done to the person or the community or the family system or the larger community. Violence is typically infused in it somehow. It causes disconnection and fear and anxiety. These are all kind of the qualities of trauma as it shows up in our world. Some examples of traumatic events, particularly for children and adolescents: childhood physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, living with someone who's mentally ill or depressed or suicidal in the home, drug addicted or alcoholic family members, witnessing domestic violence, I mentioned that, loss of a parent due to death or abandonment in the context of divorce or separation, the incarceration of family members, neglect, kidnapping, human trafficking, sexual exploitation or commercial sexual or exploitation, bullying, harassment, injuries and accidents. Car accidents often cause a traumatic response in people. A severely impaired caregiver, abandonment, traumatic loss and bereavement, and accumulated burdens of families' severe economic hardships, homelessness. These are all things that cause tremendous harm in the young people that we love and serve and the teen moms that you're walking closely with. And this is hard to grapple with. So maybe we take a deep breath when we hear these things. It's a good way to reset the nervous system. As we move into kind of the bulk of the content that I want to share with you today, I think it's helpful to this idea from trauma-informed care. There's a lot of work out there in youth development organizations, and particularly organizations and programs that are working with marginalized and oppressed adolescents and young adults, this push for trauma-informed care. And it can best be summed up by making a shift in the way that we see and assess behaviors of young people or young teen moms or adolescents or young adults, right? And so often we'll see people behave in ways that don't support their health and well-being, and we'll say, what's wrong with them? What are they not understanding? Why can't they get it? What's wrong with them, right? And there is a seemingly minor shift, but I think a very dramatic shift from saying what's wrong with this person to what happened to this person? What happened to this young woman? What happened in their family? What happened in their community? What are the messages that they've been given about who they are? And how does that impact their behaviors and mindsets? And it shifts us from judgment to curiosity. And it's powerful because then it creates space for us to get to know people, to broaden and widen our understanding of how people experience life in our society and our country differently, depending on where they were born, the color of their skin, the gender that they are, the sexual orientation that they are. These are all really important things to consider as we start to wear the hat of trauma-informed care. So I'm going to try to break it down. I'm going to give you a lot of information again. I know I mentioned that. I'm going to break it down into 5 kind of understandings or helpful ways to think about how trauma impacts adolescents, young teen moms, young adults, the kids that we love, and how it impacts their experience and their reality. All right. There's some levels to trauma. I want to think particularly about 2 ways to look at these levels of trauma. One is the different levels that harm and trauma are perpetuated through. And the second one will be the different ways or levels of how people experience trauma. And I want to start with looking at a societal perpetuation of violence and harm. And we cannot think about harm and trauma on a small scale in the interpersonal without thinking about how it's been perpetuated in our society. And for us, particularly in the U.S., in our country, we are a violent society. We rely on violence to handle conflict. We were built on violence. We are a country that was built on the colonization and genocide of the indigenous and Native American people. We are violent in the fact that we owned human beings, our brothers and sisters, and horribly mistreated them and used their bodies for our gain and profit for 400 years. And it's still happening today. We still see violence against women. Our recent Me Too movement proves that. We still see violence in sex trafficking. We still see violence in the way against the earth, in the way that we prioritize capitalization and money over taking care of the resources that are part of creation, part of God's creation. And we see it in our militarized and violent police force and criminal justice system. And so these things are all have been happening on large scales and happening disproportionately to people of color in our society. And it's really interesting to know that trauma is is generational, right? So they can see trauma in the DNA, in people's DNAs from generations past. So you can think about, for someone who is in the generational line of a slave, what it looks like to have that trauma in your DNA, to have your traumatic responses, which we'll think about a little bit later in terms of how it shows up in our body. And so we think about it first on a systemic level, and then we know that trauma happens in communities, and typically marginalized and oppressed communities, which shouldn't be surprising if we're thinking about it in this context. Then it happens in families and interpersonally, and there's lots of ways that our young people, that adolescents and teen moms that we love and serve, are navigating this. The next way that I want to think about the levels of trauma is through how we experience it, right? So there is this idea well, let me start with ACEs, and I mentioned that before. And this is a series of questions that was developed by a doctor in California who made the connection between health outcomes for people and kind of some of the adverse childhood experiences that they dealt with or navigated in their childhood. So we mentioned some of those things: abuse, mentally ill person in the home, drug and alcohol addiction for the parents, incarceration of family members, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Those are all things that are called adverse childhood experiences. Then you can think about trauma as acute, like one event that happened, one horrible thing that was so overwhelmingly scary that either threatened someone's safety or harmed someone's safety or body or emotional capacity. And then there's chronic trauma. Then there's just kind of this like, I'm living in a home where there's violence all of the time, or I'm living in a community where I hear gunshots and I witness fights. And this can oftentimes push into complex trauma, right? Or polyvictimization. And so for a lot of young people in marginalized and oppressed communities in our country, complex trauma is the norm. They've experienced trauma in lots of different forms, in lots of different ways. And we'll talk in a minute about how that impacts their development and their brain and their body and how they show up in the world. The next level that I want to talk about is toxic stress. So just this constant worry or concern that your needs won't be met, that something's going to go wrong, that you're going to lose someone, that there's a fear of abandonment. These are all realities of toxic stress. And then all the way through to insidious trauma and historical trauma. And so this is collective and massive group trauma and compounding forms of multiple oppression, including discrimination based on race, economic status, gender, sexuality, immigration status, as experienced over extended periods of time within societies and institutions. So I mentioned some of them before: colonization, genocide, slavery, poverty, internment, the ways that we interned the Japanese people in our country, people of Japanese origin in our country during World War II. These are all societal levels of trauma, and probably like the most pervasive or the biggest indicator of how trauma goes down into the smaller micro familial spaces. Yeah, that's a lot of information, and that's a lot of hard information to hear. And I recognize that in the spaces that we have privilege, it's sometimes a major blind spot that there is these realities and these systems in our country and in our society. And to be fair to us, we have grown up thinking that when the people from Europe came to America, we became fast friends with the Native Americans, and we had Thanksgiving and we had this meal together and everything was great and fine. That's not what happened. What happened is that we brought disease and we committed genocide as a country and a society in the early days that people from Europe came to America. Slavery is something that we just brush over often. Yeah, we had the Civil War and everything's okay now, and it's not, and it's still not. And I'm telling you these things because I love you, because I know that you love the young people that you serve, and that you are walking alongside these moms with these realities that they're facing. And this isn't news to people who experience privilege and oppression, or who experience oppression. One of my favorite authors, Adrienne Maree Brown, says, when we are born into privilege, we are charged with dismantling any myth of supremacy. And when we're born into struggle, where in the places that we're born into struggle, we are charged with claiming our dignity, our joy, and our liberation. And dignity and joy and liberation are certainly things that I know Jesus was concerned with, as evidenced through the way that he related to people throughout his ministry on earth, and the way that his Holy Spirit guides us now to usher in the kingdom of God. So that's number one. There are levels to trauma. There is a ton of information out there about trauma and its impacts on brain development and the body. And I can point you in the direction for some of that information. But I want to give you a quick little overview of how trauma, when it's experienced in young people and children and adolescents, impacts brain development. And so I want to think about two parts of our brain. The amygdala is the first part, and this is the part of our brain that keeps us safe, that senses harm, that alerts us to danger. It's the part of our brain often referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze part, and what we do when we experience this kind of harm and danger. And when young children are experiencing trauma, when they're hearing their families fight, when they're witnessing violence, when they're having violence, and harm is being perpetuated on them, on their bodies, um, this amygdala gets overdeveloped. Their alarm system is on alert all of the time, and that's in order to keep them safe. It's our body's response to keep them safe, and it's been so helpful for me. I remember when I was working in Red Hook, um, I was so distressed by how much marijuana the kids were smoking, right? Like 11 and 12-year-olds were starting to smoke weed. And I remember just feeling like, oh, this is so bad for their development. This is so bad for how they're going to grow and develop into adults. And when I learned this about the overactive amygdala and the way that it kind of makes your body on high alert all the time, if you can think about times in your life where your anxiety level is turned way up, and you can imagine a child, right, who is having a similar response, you can understand, right, that smoking marijuana can relax or decrease anxiety. We have an over-medicated population of adolescents at this point, and it's acceptable for kids with privilege who have access to health care to be put on medication for anxiety at young ages. Um, and it's a very similar thing. It's this anxiety and this level of anxious, and I'm always on alert, and I'm always worried that something bad is going to happen. And the prefrontal cortex is the other part of the brain that's important to understand, and that's very much what's being developed during the adolescent years. So between 12 and 25 is the late end of adolescence, as social scientists and brain scientists are learning. During those years, our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that can make sense of things, that can build analyses, that can think about through consequences of behavior, right? Versus the reptilian part of your brain, your amygdala, that's just trying to keep you safe and responding to what feels good in the moment. And so without a fully developed prefrontal cortex and with an overdeveloped amygdala, an alarm system that's always going off, that's very easily triggered, very easily activated, you can see sometimes the results in the kids that we love and serve. It's been really helpful for me to have that information when I see kids respond outside of what seems expected to circumstances. So I hope that that's helpful for you. I could go into great depth about how trauma and traumatic experiences impact identity development in adolescents and young adults. But in order to save time and to get you guys the information that's pertinent for your conversation, I'm going to fast forward a little bit and just tell you that young people's identities are very much shaped by their experience of trauma and their subsequent behaviors and ways that the ways that they carry their trauma, right? Um, Oftentimes when kids are acting out of fear or triggered trauma responses, they are disciplined and seen as bad. Messages that are given to young people, adolescents and children that experience trauma are: there's something wrong with you, you're crazy, you're bad. For young women in particular, particularly those who live in communities of oppression, there's often a message that your worth is defined by making your body available to men and how men respond to you. It's very identity shaping and causes a lot of harm. It perpetuates the harm cycle. I remember that I had a young man who in Red Hook that I knew well, and the messages that had been given to him throughout his entire childhood, and he had trauma experience after trauma experience after trauma experience, and the messages that were given to him is that his behavior made him bad, and he kind of took that on and said, well, if I'm bad, I'm going to be the best at being bad that I can be. And so it's really important as we think about the messages that come along with experiencing trauma on systemic levels too. If you can think about the messages that kids of color experience in a society that gives privilege to white people about who they are and what their worth is, this is really helpful as we'll begin to think about healing, how we can begin to offer messages of truth and affirmation in who young people are, and hope that that shapes their identity. There are many ways that the experience of trauma and chronic trauma throughout development impact the well-being of adolescents and young adults. I'm going to read some of these from this overview to you, and yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful to have this information in terms of how to assess and understand what young people and young moms are going through. It impacts young people's well-being, emotional well-being, through sadness, shock, despair, emotional numbing, helplessness, irritability, grief, guilt, loss of pleasure, phobias, and anger. There's lots of information out there about how anger is an emotion that young people feel comfortable having, but often has a lot of other emotions underneath the surface that they may or may not have awareness of. It impacts the physical well-being of young people, sleep disturbance, startle responses. That's the anxiety, the quick, like, I'm scared kind of moment. An impaired immune response, gastrointestinal problems, insomnia. Oftentimes, when I think kids aren't paying attention or kids are short with me, young people, adolescents that I've worked with, I later learn that they're just not sleeping at night, that they don't have their brain fully activated to take in information because they're not getting enough sleep because of their post-traumatic stress disorder or their experience of trauma. Decreased appetite, hyper arousal, headaches, fatigue. These are all ways that the physical well-being is impacted. Cognitively, kids are impacted with worry and disbelief, confusion, nightmares, memory impairment, impaired concentration, self-blame, decreased self-efficacy. We'll talk about self-efficacy in the final video. Distortion, decreased self-esteem, intrusive memories and thoughts. And then we can see it show up interpersonally and behaviorally through aggression, regression of behavior, crying easily, taking risks, changes in eating pattern, withdrawing socially, avoiding trauma reminders, alienation, school impairment, increased relational conflict, vocational impairment, and isolation. These are all things that science and research and people who have studied the experience of trauma have found to be true of adolescents and young adults who experienced trauma in their developmental years. And this is hard to hear, and I hope that it's also illuminating that some of the things that you're hearing here can give you some insight on maybe the trauma that's been experienced by the young moms and adolescents that you serve. Because I know all too well that Young Life is a relational ministry, I want to focus the last conversation or the last part of our conversation on the implications for building relationships with young people who have experienced trauma. Um, it's hard to build relationships with young people who haven't felt safe in relationships or haven't felt safe in the spaces that they should have felt safe in, their homes, their communities, their schools, their society. It makes it a real challenge, but a worthy challenge. It's just hard to build trust. It's hard to get people to understand that we are have their best interests in heart, and that's okay. Right? When we think about all the harm, all the wounds that they've endured, we can put in the time certainly to consistently show up and build that trust. Um, Young people are perpetually looking for safety. And so we experience that sometimes, right, where they want to feel safe, and we can even see it how they show up in relationships with significant others. I'm sure for teen moms, when they return to relationships that aren't healthy, that they have this deep desire to feel safe, but then they can't ever feel safe. So it's this kind of dissonance that they live in, cognitive dissonance that they live in, that makes it really hard to navigate relationships and their life with other people. The other thing that makes it really hard for people who've experienced trauma is that they're easily triggered. And so they might, and we mentioned this before, they might not have awareness about the things that trigger their trauma responses, the things that um, make their body remember the time that they weren't safe. They don't always have the ability to connect those dots. But it shows up as sometimes offensive or hard for people that want to be close to them to hold space for, and it's just worth knowing that that's part of their reality. And they also have a fear of abandonment, and so you might notice that young teen moms or teenagers step a couple steps forward, and then they'll step like 5 steps back and say, nope, 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 I'm not going to let you walk away from me. I'm not going to get too attached here. And so those are very real realities that are not based on who they are in their truest, most healthy place, but who they are because of the harm that's been done to them and the ways that they've grown up without access to safety and love and belonging and all of the things that the human spirit and the human body longs for. Um, so again, I just gave you so much information, and I hope that it was helpful. I hope that it challenged you to think about things in new ways. I hope it gave you insight and hope for some of the young moms, the teen moms, and their families that you walk closely with. Um, there is good news coming, but I'm going to let you sit with this hard stuff, just like the Sin Talk at camp. I'm going to let you sit with the knowledge of the reality of the young people that we love. And I will see you next time to think through how we can create conditions for growth and healing.